my friend, Member for Rhondda, for securing this debate at a really important time. I don't think I can emulate his Spanish accent in my remarks, but it really was an excellent speech. I should also mention I visited Colombia last month alongside Justice for Colombia, who paid for my visit. I also am waiting for final details in order to put my entry in the members' register. It's also good to see the Minister in his place today, and can I thank him again for meeting with me just before summer recess and the offer last week of a further meeting following my visit. And as we've heard today, Colombia is such a country of contrasts. It's the most beautiful of countries, but it's also a country scarred by decades of civil war that's seen hundreds of thousands of people disappeared, murdered, tortured, including predominantly trade unionists, human rights defenders and social leaders. And it still is the most dangerous place in the world to be a trade unionist. And that's why, in November 2016, the signing of the peace agreement was such a moment of hope for Colombia and for those of us here today and around the world who have a specific interest in the country. An agreement to end the armed conflict through a ceasefire and disarmament by the FARC, a new special jurisdiction and courts and a truth commissioner, political participation by the FARC as a legal political party with seats in the Congress and the House of Representatives, land reform, which my friend has talked about, and the substitution of illegal crops with time-limited subsidies to peasant farmers. And overseeing all of that, a United Nations verification mission. So nearly 2 years on from that historic signing and 9 years since I first went to Colombia, I went back there last month with some colleagues from Parliament, trade union leaders, lawyers, and one of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commissioners as part of Justice for Colombia's peace monitoring delegation. I know the Minister is very aware of the work of JFC, and I wanted to place on record my admiration for the incredible work that it has done since it was set up by the trade union movement in 2002. It's supported Colombian civil society in defence of human rights, labour rights, peace and social justice. And over the last few years, the involvement of the Irish trade union movement and Irish politicians from the entirety of the island of Ireland have shared their experiences of the Good Friday Agreement and how they negotiated that and how they dealt with the implementation, which I know has been of considerable benefit to the Colombian government and to the FARC in learning the lessons of how to construct and deliver a peace agreement. So I was struck when I first went to Colombia that the job that I did then, which was as a trade union lawyer, would have placed me in the situation where my life was at risk, and even now as an opposition MP, I'd probably be in the same situation. And the people I met in 2009 sparked my long-standing interest in the country, and that was why I was really desperate to go back there this year, particularly to see how the peace agreement is progressing. And I arrived in Bogotá the day after President Duque was inaugurated. He ran his campaign on a promise to dismantle parts of the peace agreement. I hope that that will not be seen through in his government. I suspect he's going to have more problems in delivering that dismantling element of his manifesto than he originally thought. But the agreement itself is very fragile and the progress of its implementation is very slow. And based on what I saw in my time-limited visit, I'm sorry to say some of it is non-existent. In addition to meeting with members of all the opposition parties, with the UN, with diplomats and trade union leaders in Bogotá, we travelled on our delegation to meet people in rural regions, both in the north and in the northeast of the country and on the border with Venezuela. So in the oil-rich region of Arauca, we visited one of the 26 zones in which former FARC combatants and their families are being reintegrated into civil society, and they call it reincorporation in Colombia. The journey we took from Bogotá to Filipinas there, we went on a plane, and not a little plane, as little as the Honourable Member for Rhondda's, but a plane and then on a bus. What we saw during that journey and what we heard and saw when we got there was a clear demonstration of how what has been promised and agreed in the peace agreement has not materialised in terms of a failure to provide the basic resources necessary for reincorporation to succeed. So you can only reach Filipinas by a dirt, rubble and huge crater-strewn track, which becomes completely impassable in the frequent heavy rain. It took us 5 hours to travel 70 miles. People in Filipinas can't access education. Some have died trying to get out of the camp, because essentially that's what it is, to get medical treatment. And the small amounts of fresh produce that they can grow just won't survive a journey from the camp to the nearest town along that track, because by the time you get there, the crop is destroyed. One former FARC combatant explained to me, she said that they've managed to build some homes, but because of the rain, the homes flood. So they have water pouring in from the roofs of their homes, but they don't have any water in their toilets because there's no mains water for them. The lack of access to education and the inability to make a living not only makes that life very difficult there, but it creates a kind of area of criminality, so that's the only option for some people because they can't survive through legal means. The camp in Filipinas was only partially constructed, and people there explained to me that they have the skills to build and complete the houses and infrastructure. But because of the bureaucracy involved in getting the funds from central government to the local authorities to approved contractors to carry out the work, and because of the endemic corruption in Colombia, very little of that funding gets through. And so this is why infrastructure is not happening. And I just wondered whether the Minister could consider discussing with his colleagues in DFID whether there is specific funding or assistance that the UK government could provide that could be ring-fenced to target things like the building of a road, a 70-mile road that would make a transformational difference to this sort of community. Likewise, in Tibu, it's just 12 kilometres from the Venezuelan border. I met many campesinos, peasant farmers and social leaders, and we've repeatedly heard evidence about how the voluntary crop substitution programme is not working. Many families have signed up for the programme, but again, the funds are not coming through, and the implementation of productive projects is not happening. I met the head of the chocolate farmers cooperative, who said that hundreds of families had signed up to the crop substitution programme because there's a huge internal demand for chocolate in Colombia, and having tasted it, it is the most fantastic chocolate. So never mind the internal demand, they want to be able to export this fantastic product and grow the business and the industry, but they can't do it because of the lack of implementation of the agreement. And in both the areas that I went to, both those rural regions, obviously the challenges created by the arrival of people fleeing from Venezuela, which has already been touched upon, is a huge concern. I travelled through Cucuta, which is the main entry point from Venezuela, in Colombia from Venezuela, and where over 1 million people have passed through, either staying in Colombia or moving on to other Latin American countries. And many of these people are second-generation Colombians who had fled Colombia in the beginning because of the dangers to them, but are now returning as economic refugees from Venezuela. And people in Arauca particularly said to me, we want to welcome them back, we want to help them, we've shared our food with them, but actually we've no money, we've so little food, we can barely feed all the people in our zone, never mind be able to help those who are arriving. And that's quite naturally creating tensions there. And I'm really concerned, of all the problems that Colombia has had and still has in terms of being able to implement the agreement, the problems with Venezuela and the arrival of over 1 million people, I think, on its own, could scupper the peace agreement. Colleagues have already talked about the numbers of murders, so I won't repeat what has been said already, but I just wanted to make the point that during the elections, because obviously the two-stage elections for the presidential elections, there was a real spike in assassinations in Colombia. In the first month of President Duque's administration, 33 social leaders have been murdered. Over 80 FARC members or family members have been killed since the start of the peace process. And we know that after a peace agreement, there is always a really dangerous period initially, and there's an expectation that there will be problems. But, this is a tragic situation, and one which we really need to help Colombia all we can to prevent. I've mentioned the dissident guerrilla groups moving into those previously FARC-controlled zones where effectively there is no policing, the army can't operate in there, so there's no protection for people who are living there. And I asked specifically, during my visit, I asked the police and I asked the army, I asked the UN about the numbers of prosecutions and convictions that have taken place since 2016, based on those hundreds of murders. And I'm not aware or wasn't told of a single conviction since that date. And the Minister, I know, is aware of the long-standing problems created by the culture of impunity in Colombia. And I hope he will address in his response to the debate today what steps the government is taking to impress upon the Colombian government, and particularly the Fiscalia, that impunity has to stop if there is to be any chance of the agreement succeeding. I just now want to turn to one of the most important elements of the peace agreement, which is political participation. And as part of the agreement, the FARC have 10 seats in Congress for the 2 electoral periods starting this year. And when Congress opened in July, only 8 of the 10 congressmen and women elect were able to take up their positions. 2 of them, Jesus Santrich and Ivan Marquez, could not. Jesus Santrich has received his official accreditation as a member of Congress, but he's been unable to take his seat up because he's been held in prison since April under threat of extradition to the United States. And Ivan Marquez, who was the head negotiator for the FARC during the peace talks, left Bogotá in the aftermath of Santrich's arrest because of his concern about the lack of guarantees that he won't be subjected to political and legal persecution. On the 17th of August, I visited Jesus Santrich in his maximum security prison in La Picota in Bogotá. After a couple of hours going through the various checks and fingerprinting and questions, we arrived in a wing in a very large, noisy prison where he is kept in isolation. He has a small cell with a bed, a light and a toilet, and he has nothing else in that cell. He is a former FARC leader who was involved in the drafting and negotiation of the peace agreement with the Colombian government negotiators. He's the subject of this US extradition threat based on an allegation that he has conspired to smuggle 10 tons of cocaine out of Colombia on an aeroplane. He categorically denies this allegation. He is blind. He suffers from a degenerative eye condition, which has become so severe that his sight is almost non-existent. He has other major health problems. No evidence has been presented to him, to his lawyers, or to any court in Colombia to back up this allegation. He's essentially in administrative detention, prevented by the Colombian Attorney General from swearing in as a member of Congress, despite a constitutional right to do so. He's been denied any equipment to help him cope with his disability in prison, no braille pen, no audio books, no voice recorder. He can't have anyone read to him. He can't have a radio or a television, unlike all the other prisoners. All the other prisoners can have a visitor on a Wednesday, bring them in some food. He's been denied this. He's not allowed any contact with any other prisoners. He has been on a 41-day hunger strike to protest against his treatment. He's very frail, still losing weight, and obviously showing the strains of nearly 5 months incarceration. Previously, he'd been locked in his cell for 24 hours a day. Shortly before we visited, that regime had been changed to allow him out for 1 hour every 24 hours. He is entitled to have his case considered by the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, which is called a HEP, established under the agreement. And on the day I was there, he'd been told that the HEP, there'd been a decision by the Constitutional Court that the HEP must be allowed to review any evidence against him. But there are widespread concerns that have already been alluded to about the ability of the court to operate free from government interference. It's really worrying that one of his lawyers for the transitional justice process, Enrique Santiago, has been denied entry to the prison to speak to him on 2 occasions. I know that Enrique is hoping to visit him on the 17th of September, and I'll be following that up to ensure that due process and Jesus' fundamental right to access to his lawyer is respected. I'll give way.
She really is making a powerful speech. And can I say I've not been to Colombia. That's something I hope to put right in the near future. But On the point about Jesus, does she agree with, does it concern her, like it concerns me, the use of American extradition as a threat against people who are part of the peace process? And would she, through the minister, appeal to the Americans to review this, the use of extradition as a threat to people who have played a very active role in bringing the peace process to where it is today?
Two further speakers to call, and we do want to start the front bench speeches at 3:30.
Thank you, Mr. Robertson. I will wrap up. I'll just wrap up with a few questions just to ask the Minister. I obviously agree with that point, and I hope the Minister will address that. That was one of the points I was going to ask him about. So my first question for the Minister, I have three. Will he make representations to the Colombian government about the conditions in which Jesus Sanchez is being held, and particularly about the lack of access to disability aids? Secondly, will he also impress upon the government the absolute right of lawyers to visit in order to prepare his case for the HEP? And I take on board the point raised by the Honourable Member for Eltham. And finally, Senator Victoria Sandino, who is another FARC senator, is visiting the UK at the end of this month. She led on the peace agreement on the gender aspects and equality aspects. I know a request has been made to the Minister's office for him to meet Senator Sandino, and if he was able to give a positive indication to that invitation today, that would be very welcome. Thank you, Mr.